You find yourself in the year 1100, in the cool, damp air of an English autumn. The roads are churned to mud from weeks of rain, and the scent of wood smoke clings to every breath. Somewhere beyond the grey horizon, the bells of Westminster toll a slow rhythm, announcing not death, but a marriage. The bride is Matilda of Scotland, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret of Wessex. The groom, Henry, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, has just seized the throne of England after his brother William's untimely death during a hunting accident. The match is one of both politics and piety, and yet, as you'll come to see, it becomes a reflection of something deeper, the silent endurance required of women born into crowns. Matilda was not raised in luxury. Her mother, Margaret, was known for her strict piety and education, a rarity in a time when few women could read, and fewer still could reason in Latin. The young Matilda was sent as a child to the convents of Romsey and Wilton, not to become a nun, but to learn discipline, reading, and moral restraint. There, she lived among veiled women, their days filled with quiet repetition, prayer, weaving, illumination of manuscripts, and the occasional sound of laughter when the abbess was not listening. It was a cloistered existence, and yet it formed the rhythm of her entire life. Even as she became queen, her habits would echo those convent walls. Early rising, plain dress, and a love of written word. When Henry sought a wife, his advisors reminded him that stability could not come through war alone. His elder brother Robert still contested the English crown, and Norman lords wavered in their loyalties. He needed legitimacy, and Matilda, granddaughter of the ancient Anglo-Saxon kings, offered precisely that. But there was a problem. Matilda's time in the convent raised rumours that she had taken religious vows. To marry a supposed nun was, in the eyes of the church, a grave sin. When questioned, Matilda insisted she had never been veiled, only educated, though several abbesses testified otherwise. The Archbishop of Canterbury hesitated. Chroniclers recorded weeks of debate, letters sent to Rome, and the strange sight of a would-be queen defending her right to not be a nun. In the end, the church relented, perhaps swayed by Henry's royal authority. The marriage went forward on the 11th of November, 1100, at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was austere, conducted beneath flickering candles and the heavy scent of beeswax. Henry, though known for his learning, was a man of rigid temper and political calculation. Matilda, pale and serious, stood beside him, a queen already marked by duty before her crown touched her hair. Her life as queen was not one of romance or ease. The medieval chroniclers rarely mention her laughter, though they speak often of her charity. She spent hours daily in prayer, fasting during Lent to the point of fainting, and personally washing the feet of the poor, a ritual intended to imitate Christ, though few queens performed it with such sincerity. But even her piety was a form of politics. Each act of humility strengthened the crown's image. Henry's claim to the throne was young and contested. Matilda's holiness softened it, made it seem ordained. Her court became known for its learning and austerity. Visitors found it unlike the rowdy Norman courts of old. Instead of hunting and feasting, Matilda encouraged scholars, poets, and clerics. She corresponded with Anselm of Canterbury, debated matters of theology, and intervened in church disputes with a quiet diplomacy that was both feminine and formidable. Still, the Queen's days were long and largely predictable. At dawn, she heard Mass. In mid-morning, she oversaw the distribution of alms, sacks of grain, old garments, sometimes coins, carefully counted into the hands of the poor who gathered outside the palace gates. At midday, she dined lightly, bread, fish, a small cup of watered wine. In the afternoons, she worked at her embroidery or read from illuminated psalters, occasionally meeting with clerics or scribes. Henry, often away on campaign or council, trusted her to govern in his absence. This meant long hours in cold chambers, listening to petitions, settling disputes over land, and signing documents that bore her seal, a small circle of wax, carved with her image, a symbol of feminine authority rare for her time. One might imagine her surrounded by luxury, golden goblets, silken gowns, tapestries from Flanders. But the reality was less romantic. Even a queen's castle was draughty and dim. The hearth smoked, the servants whispered, and the corridors echoed with footsteps. She slept under heavy wool blankets and woke to frost on her windows. When her children were born, a daughter, Matilda, and a son, William, her days grew even more constrained. Childbirth was perilous, and recovery slow. Chroniclers mention her long hours of prayer afterward, thanking God for survival. Her daughter, destined to become Empress Matilda, would inherit her strength and her share of sorrow. As years passed, Queen Matilda's reputation grew. She was called the Good Queen Maud, beloved by clergy and commoners alike. Yet her goodness was not of passive sweetness. It was a deliberate construction of power through patience. She knew that in the world of kings and soldiers, her virtue was her armor. There were whispers that Henry loved her in his own way, not with the passion of youth, but with respect. They were equals in intellect, if not in station. She spoke several languages. He, though a warrior, was known as Henry Beauclerc, Henry the Scholar. In their long evenings together, perhaps they shared more words than most royal couples of their time. But peace is never permanent in medieval England. As Henry consolidated his rule, rebellion brewed in Normandy, and famine stalked parts of the countryside. Matilda's letters reveal a deep concern for the suffering of her people. In one account, she ordered bread baked from the royal stores distributed to the poor during a harsh winter, an act that endeared her to many, but annoyed her husband's treasurers. The details of her later years blur into routine. Prayers, councils, letters, births, burials, the dullness of power, the monotony of virtue. Yet within that stillness lies the shape of her reign, a reminder that not all influence shouts. Some of it whispers, patiently, across generations. She died in 1118, at the age of 38, likely from exhaustion or illness after years of fasting and strain. Her death was quiet, almost unnoticed in the larger turmoil of her husband's wars. But when the chroniclers later wrote of her, they called her a model queen, not for her conquests, but for her discipline. When Queen Matilda of Scotland died in 1118, her passing left a quiet vacancy at the heart of the English court. The bells tolled from Westminster to Winchester, and for a few brief days, the kingdom seemed to pause in reverence. Chroniclers wrote that even the poorest peasants remembered her generosity, the woman who gave bread in winter, and whose hands, pale and strong, once washed their feet in imitation of Christ. But grief does not linger long in royal halls. Henry I, ever pragmatic, returned to governance. England was still young under Norman rule, and rebellion was never far away. His wife's calm presence had balanced his temper. Now, without her, the court grew more severe. The warmth that Queen Matilda brought her scholars, her acts of charity, her gentle diplomacy faded into the cold rhythm of administration. Her daughter, Matilda, was only around 16 when her mother died. Though born in London, she would spend much of her youth in a foreign empire. The echoes of her mother's name would follow her all her life. A name that meant discipline, strength in battle, and, for this young girl, expectation, a daughter sent away. In the spring of 1110 years before her mother's death, the young Matilda had already been taken from England. Her father had arranged her betrothal to Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Christendom. The match promised prestige, But it was also a gamble. England was a small kingdom compared to the vast empire of Germany, and alliances could shift like sand in the wind. At just 8 years old, the princess was sent across the Channel, escorted by bishops and knights, into a world of different customs, languages, and expectations. Chroniclers described her as precocious, proud, and intensely educated, a mirror of her mother's piety and her father's intellect. In Mainz, she was greeted not as a child, but as an imperial consort in training. The journey must have been overwhelming. She travelled through stormy seas, muddy roads, and foreign courts, where every gesture was watched. Her tutors continued her lessons in Latin, theology, and statecraft. By 12, she could debate scripture and speak fluent French, English, and German. When she was formally crowned Empress of the Romans in 1116, it was a spectacle of gold and incense. Yet beneath the ceremony lay the same cold truth her mother had known. Her life belonged to the ambitions of men, the echo of two Matildas. Though separated by distance and title, mother and daughter shared a peculiar symmetry. Both were queens of intellect rather than affection. Both had to prove legitimacy in a world that doubted their right to rule. And both learned to navigate the silent corridors of power through patience rather than rebellion, at least for a time. Letters from the imperial court suggest that Empress Matilda remembered her mother with admiration tinged by sorrow. She kept a psalter her mother had given her, a small, worn book, bound in leather, annotated with prayers, written in a fine, feminine hand. She often quoted her mother's lessons in humility, though her life would require more defiance than submission. Meanwhile, in England, Henry I grew old. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, a tragedy that shook the realm. Chroniclers recorded the king's grief as a wound that never closed. Suddenly, the future of the dynasty hung by a thread. And so, in the absence of his son, Henry summoned his daughter the Empress back to England. It was an unusual decision. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right. Yet Matilda, the emperor's widow by then, was the only surviving legitimate heir. Her father demanded that the nobles swear oaths to her succession. They did so, reluctantly. The chroniclers note that they called her Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English. Still, beneath the surface of obedience lay unease. The English barons murmured among themselves. Could a woman rule? Could an empress, proud and foreign in manner, command their loyalty? Henry I, remembering his late wife's quiet authority, believed it possible. Perhaps he saw in his daughter the same calm strength that had once steadied him. But history, as it turned out, was not inclined toward calmness. The civil war of a woman's claim. When Henry I died in 1135, chaos followed. Despite their oaths, the nobles crowned Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, as king. Stephen was amiable, brave, and pliable qualities that made him easier to serve than the stern Empress Matilda. Matilda, furious but cautious, gathered support across the Channel. She was not the queen her mother had been. Where Queen Matilda had ruled through mercy, the Empress ruled through resolve. Her time in the Empire had taught her command, not compromise. She crossed into England in 1139, sparking a civil conflict that would last nearly 20 years. This period became known as the Anarchy, a time when Christ and his saints slept. As one chronicler lamented, castles burned, harvests rotted, and loyalties shifted like tides. Matilda's campaigns were marked by both brilliance and stubbornness. She was intelligent, strategic, and unyielding, but her temperament alienated many of her supporters. Chroniclers, almost all men, described her as haughty and unfeminine. They mocked her insistence on being called empress, not lady, seeing in her pride what they refused to see as strength. And yet, one cannot help but sense her mother's ghost in the margins of this war. The patient queen, whose humility had preserved the throne for her husband, now mirrored by a daughter whose defiance would nearly destroy it. Life in the shadows of power. During her years of conflict, Empress Matilda endured both victory and humiliation. In 1141, her forces captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln, and she was, for a brief moment, the de facto ruler of England. At Winchester, she was greeted as Domina Anglorum, preparing for coronation. Yet her triumph was short-lived. The citizens of London, weary of her imperious manner and fearful of her taxation demands, rose against her. She fled the city in disguise, cloaked and silent, riding through the night. There is a strange quiet in the chronicles that follow. The once mighty empress became a wanderer, living in fortresses, sleeping in damp chambers, negotiating with nobles who spoke to her as though she were both monarch and beggar. She continued her struggle for years, but never again came so close to the crown. Still, her persistence bore fruit. Her son, Henry of Anjou, would eventually inherit the throne as Henry II, founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. It was through her, and through the memory of her mother, that England's royal line survived. The thread between them. If Queen Matilda's reign was quiet endurance, Empress Matilda's life was loud perseverance. The two women, separated by generation, represented opposite faces of medieval womanhood. One patient, one defiant, yet both were bound by the same burden: to uphold dynastic order in a world that saw women as its ornaments, not its anchors. When Empress Matilda retired to Rouen later in life, she turned increasingly to religion and reflection. She lived not as a nun, but in a state of contemplative retreat. Much like her grandmother, Saint Margaret, she sponsored churches, endowed monasteries, and corresponded with bishops. In her letters, one occasionally finds hints of her mother's influence, references to discipline, humility, and divine order. She died in 1167, nearly half a century after her mother, and was buried in the Abbey of Bec-Hellouin in Normandy. Her tomb bore the simple inscription, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring." But one cannot help wondering whether she would have preferred a different epitaph, one that spoke not of birth or marriage, but of endurance. A queen's legacy reborn. By the time Henry II ascended the throne, the world had changed. England was stronger, its administration more centralized, its rulers more literate, perhaps in part because of the example set by those two Matildas. The education of royal daughters now mattered more. The idea of a learned, capable queen, once almost unthinkable, had become a quiet expectation. Scholars and chroniclers began to speak of the wisdom of women, albeit in cautious tones. In the shadows of this transformation stood the memory of the first Queen Matilda, who had once ruled through prayer and parchment, rather than sword and steel. Her reign had seemed unremarkable in its time, a queen who fasted too often, who spent her days distributing alms and writing letters. Yet her influence had extended far beyond her years. Through her daughter, she had shaped the destiny of an empire. Through her example, she had redefined what it meant to be a woman of power. And yet, as the centuries passed, her name faded into quiet footnotes, overshadowed by her daughter's wars and her grandson's conquests. Only the scholars and monks remembered the woman who prayed in silence, who ruled without spectacle, and who taught her daughter that authority, in whatever form it takes, must always be worn with composure. And so we are left to wonder, in a world that remembers conquerors more readily than caretakers, what remains of the queens who held kingdoms together, not through war, but through will? What, truly, is the legacy of silence? By the time Empress Matilda's life drew to a close in 1167, England had entered a new phase of stability, though not without scars. The decades-long civil war known as the Anarchy had devastated towns, burned harvests, and reshaped loyalties. Yet from that chaos emerged a cautious acknowledgement of something extraordinary. A woman could claim power, endure it, and ensure its survival for her progeny. The stories of Queen Matilda of Scotland and her daughter, the Empress Matilda, reveal a long, quiet thread of influence that runs through medieval history, the type that rarely makes it into epic tales of battles and kings. It is a subtle power, one exercised through discipline, intelligence, and moral authority. It is the power of endurance, of long-term thinking, and of shaping events, not by force alone, but through patience, presence, and preparation. The mother, authority in quiet ritual. Queen Matilda's life, when examined closely, was full of small but significant acts of authority. Her days consisted of seemingly mundane routines: prayer, fasting, almsgiving, reading, supervising court affairs. Yet each act reinforced the crown and cultivated loyalty. She intervened in disputes among her husband's barons, mediated conflicts with calm judgment, and fostered education and literacy in her court. She personally oversaw charities that not only helped the poor but stabilized communities, distributing grain during famines, funding the repair of bridges, and commissioning manuscripts. Each effort might have seemed minor, but cumulatively, they reinforced the legitimacy of Henry I's rule. In essence, her life demonstrated that ruling was not only about military strength or royal spectacle. It was about daily diligence and about building a moral and administrative framework for her family's dynasty. Though her death at 38 might have seemed untimely, her influence was preserved in the upbringing of her children, particularly her daughter, who inherited not only her bloodline, but her disciplined approach to governance. The daughter, power through persistence. Empress Matilda's life can be read as an amplification of her mother's lessons. She did not simply repeat her mother's calmness, she transformed it into action. Where Queen Matilda had soothed tensions, the Empress fought them sometimes at great personal risk. She led armies, negotiated with barons, and demanded oaths of loyalty in a male-dominated world that was largely unprepared for a woman claiming kingship. Her brief, tumultuous control over England in 1141 demonstrates the complexity of female authority in medieval Europe. When she was proclaimed Lady of the English and nearly crowned, it was not because she commanded armies of conquest, but because she had cultivated legitimacy through lineage, education, and diplomacy. And yet, when her style clashed with the expectations of nobles, she faced rebellion and flight, disguised, silent, and vulnerable, reminding the chroniclers that even a woman of extraordinary ability could be undone by social perception. Still, she persisted. Even in defeat, her strategic patience ensured that her son, Henry II, would eventually inherit the throne. Through this, she shaped the future of the English monarchy, proving that influence could be exercised subtly, patiently, and indirectly, qualities her mother had modeled decades earlier. The thread between them. It is striking to see how these two lives intersect across time. Queen Matilda cultivated moral authority and courtly discipline, laying a foundation for dynastic survival. Empress Matilda transformed those qualities into direct political action, testing the limits of female authority in a feudal society. Together, they represent two sides of the same coin: endurance and defiance, humility and resolve, patience and ambition. Medieval chroniclers, however, often misunderstood or minimized these contributions. Women's roles in governance, especially when exercised quietly or behind the scenes, were less likely to be recorded than battles or male lineages. Thus, much of what we know comes from interpreting letters, charters, donations to churches, and subtle references in monastic records. Reading these, we begin to see the hidden architecture of influence, the ways a queen's prayer, charity, or careful letter writing could shape the survival of a kingdom. Queen Matilda and her daughter remind us that power is not always loud. Often, it is quiet, methodical, and painstaking, the kind of influence that moves slowly but irrevocably, like the rise of a tide that reshapes a coastline. Daily life as political strategy. If you attempt to imagine the lives of these women in detail, the seemingly boring aspects of their routines gain weight. Consider Queen Matilda rising before dawn, reciting psalms by candlelight while frost creeps along stone floors, instructing her servants in charitable distributions, and managing disputes over estates with legal notes carefully copied in her hand. To us, these activities might appear mundane, a long list of repetitive tasks. Yet in a medieval context, they were political strategy in action. Every act of piety, every correspondence with a cleric, every oversight of royal finances was a thread woven into the stability of Henry I's reign. Similarly, Empress Matilda's strategic patience often involved weeks or months of correspondence, careful negotiation, and calculated alliances, less glamorous than a battlefield, but no less decisive. Her meticulous attention to loyalty, timing, and symbolic gestures enabled her to secure a future for her son and, indirectly, reshape English history. Even embroidery, reading, and religious observance were intertwined with influence. Books were repositories of knowledge, prayers were political statements, and personal discipline was a demonstration of legitimacy. In this way, the mundane aspects of royal life were inseparable from governance, the long shadow of influence. Over time, the influence of the two Matildas extended far beyond their lifetimes. Their descendants carried forward lessons of female authority and strategic patience. Henry II, Richard I, and John inherited a kingdom in which literacy, diplomacy, and structured governance mattered, values reinforced by the quiet matriarchal hand of Matilda of Scotland and the resolute action of her daughter. Queen Matilda's canonization of moral and practical authority, her quiet insistence that a queen could be learned, charitable, and disciplined, created a template for medieval queens who followed. Empress Matilda's insistence that a woman could claim power even at great personal cost challenged societal expectations and, in doing so, expanded the conceptual space for female rulership. Their combined legacy is thus both subtle and profound. It is not celebrated in epic poetry or sung in the halls of kings. It is measured in the survival of dynasties, the endurance of governance structures, and the quiet inspiration it provided to later queens navigating treacherous political waters. A reflection on silence and survival. As we look back on these two lives, a broader question emerges. What does it mean to wield power quietly? For most historians, dramatic battles, public triumphs, and violent coups define the narrative of medieval history. Yet the endurance of kingdoms often rested on the hidden, repetitive, and meticulous work of women like Matilda and her daughter. Consider their everyday actions: teaching their children, negotiating with religious authorities, distributing alms, copying letters, and maintaining households that doubled as political institutions. The repetition, the mundanity, the slow, persistent labor. These were the instruments of survival. History may record kings on thrones, but it is often queens in shadow who maintain the foundations beneath them. And as you lie awake pondering these lives, perhaps the most remarkable question is this: how many other women, quietly ruling through prayer, charity, and disciplined routine, and have shaped the world without ever being remembered? How many legacies exist not in chronicles of war, but in the slow, almost invisible work of endurance, in the quiet chambers of Westminster and Rouen, in frost-covered cloisters, in the careful folding of letters and the distribution of grain? The Matildas of medieval England remind us that history is made not only by swords, but by patience, resilience, and the small, deliberate actions of women who refuse to be invisible. And so their story ends not with a dramatic coronation or conquest, but with a whisper, a legacy built on the ordinary, the repetitive, and the enduring. A reminder that influence often travels silently through time, carried by those who act with discipline, foresight, and courage in the shadowed corners of power. You awaken in the warmth of southern France, sometime around the year 1122, in the vast and fertile lands of Aquitaine. The air smells faintly of vineyards and rosemary. The rivers glimmer with slow-moving silver. The land stretches wide and generous, a realm of troubadours, merchants, and sunlit courts. It is here, amid this soft abundance, that Eleanor of Aquitaine is born, destined to become one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages and one of the most misunderstood. Yet, before she was a queen, before she ruled England and France, led armies, and scandalized chroniclers, Eleanor was simply an heiress. The word carried weight. It meant privilege, but also peril. For an heiress was not free. She was a prize. A childhood in the South, Eleanor was born to Duke William X of Aquitaine and Ainor de Châtellerault, a noblewoman of refined education. Her birthplace, likely Poitiers, was the heart of a duchy larger and richer than the Kingdom of France itself. Her ancestors had ruled Aquitaine for generations, and her family traced its line to the legendary troubadours poets who turned love into an art form. The world Eleanor knew as a child was unlike the cold, disciplined courts of the north. Aquitaine was vibrant, indulgent, and deeply cultured. Music echoed through its halls. Knights competed in song as well as swordsmanship. Women in this southern world were afforded a curious measure of respect. Not equality, but presence. They could preside over courts of love, arbitrate disputes, and shape reputation through wit and charm. Eleanor grew up amid tapestries and poetry, trained in both the genteel arts and the hard logic of politics. She learned Latin, read classical texts, and observed her father manage vassals and estates. The life of a duchess was never idle. It was a rhythm of correspondence, negotiation, and ceremony. The Duke expected his daughter to be educated not for leisure, but for leadership. When her mother died in 1130, and her only brother followed soon after, Eleanor became the sole heir to the duchy. The inheritance transformed her from a girl into a target. Every lord in Europe knew that whoever married her would command the wealth of Aquitaine, a territory stretching from the Pyrenees to the Loire, from the Atlantic to the heart of France. A duke's anxiety. Her father, William X, understood the danger. Anne, heiress of such magnitude, could not remain unprotected. He began arranging for her education and future with great care, sending her to trusted tutors who taught her scripture, literature, and governance. In the long afternoons of her adolescence, Eleanor would have heard lectures not only on piety, but on politics. How to judge between quarreling vassals, how to manage revenues, how to maintain authority in the face of rebellion. Her father's court was no mere pageant. It was a school for survival. William's letters show both affection and unease. He called his daughter the child of my heart, but also fretted over her safety. The southern duchies were notorious for their independence. A weak ruler could be undone in months. Eleanor would need more than beauty and grace. She would need shrewdness. In 1137, when she was about 15, her father set out on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, a journey that would prove fatal. Before departing, he made careful arrangements with King Louis VI of France, known as Louis the Fat. Should he die on pilgrimage, his daughter's guardianship, and thus her hand in marriage, would pass to the French king. It was a decision that would alter the course of history. The death of a duke. The road to Santiago was long, rough, and treacherous. William X, a vigorous man, fell ill near Easter and died suddenly. His death sent shockwaves through Aquitaine. The Great Duchy, wealthy and proud, was now led by a teenage girl. Messengers galloped north to Paris to inform King Louis VI of the Duke's death and the fulfillment of his promise. The French court reacted swiftly. Within days, the king arranged for his son Louis the Younger, destined soon to be Louis VII, to marry Eleanor. The match was more than convenient. It was brilliant. By uniting Aquitaine with France through marriage, the Capetian crown would double its territory and influence. The arrangements were made with remarkable haste. Within weeks, the royal escort set out for Poitiers to bring the young heiress north. The chroniclers tell us the journey took place under the hot summer sun, the roads crowded with nobles and retainers. Eleanor, dressed in silks, travelled with her ladies, her father's counsellors, and the weight of her duchy's future resting on her shoulders. A sudden marriage. Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII of France took place in July 1137, almost immediately after her father's burial. She was 15. He was 17. The ceremony, performed in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, was solemn and politically charged. The two young royals could not have been more different. Eleanor, lively and sophisticated, had grown up in a court where poetry and laughter were daily fare. Louis had been raised in a monastery, originally destined for a life in the church, until his elder brother's death made him heir to the throne. He was devout, cautious, and unworldly, a boy who preferred prayer to politics. Their union was one of political necessity rather than personal harmony, yet to the watching world, it appeared a triumph of dynastic ambition. On the same week as their wedding, news arrived that Louis VI had died. The young couple became King and Queen of France overnight, Queen of France at 15. To imagine Eleanor's life at this moment is to imagine a sudden shift from sunlight to shadow. One day she ruled as Duchess of Aquitaine in a world of warmth and independence. The next, she stood as Queen of France in the austere, damp, and rigid court of Paris. Her husband, newly crowned, adored her, but did not understand her. The chroniclers note that he treated her as a holy relic, rather than a partner, respectful, reverent, but distant. His court, dominated by clerics, found her southern manners unsettling. Her lively conversation, her music, her open laughter, all seemed out of place in the chill solemnity of the northern kingdom. In the long halls of the French palace, Eleanor found herself surrounded by monks and advisors who regarded her as frivolous. Her clothes were too fine, her speech too bold, yet she refused to dim her spirit. She brought her troubadours north, reintroducing poetry and song to a court that had long forgotten them. For the first time in decades, laughter and music returned to Paris, though not everyone appreciated it. The chronicler William of Newburgh would later write, not admiringly, that she corrupted the court with the softness of the South, the burden of expectation. As queen, Eleanor's duties were endless yet oddly empty. She attended councils, signed charters, and bore witness to royal decrees. She travelled with the king on his processions and served as intercessor for petitioners. She was expected to produce heirs, to embody piety, and to never contradict her husband's counsel. Yet Eleanor was no silent figurehead. When disputes arose in Aquitaine, she intervened, personally. She corresponded with local lords, issued commands in her own name, and reminded her husband that her lands were hers by right, not his by conquest. This independence was tolerated, but barely. To Louis's clerical advisors, Eleanor was a source of both fascination and unease. A woman too educated, too assertive, too willing to question. They recorded her words not as wisdom but as impertinence. Still, she endured, shaping her role within the narrow confines of expectation. She began to understand, perhaps more deeply than anyone at court, the delicate weight of being both necessary and resented. admired for what she brought, yet constrained by what she represented. The journey south. In 1145, after years of a marriage strained by difference, an event would arise that promised purpose: the Second Crusade. Pope Eugenius III called for Christian forces to march east and defend the Holy Lands. Louis, eager for redemption after a disastrous conflict in Burgundy, vowed to lead the crusade. Eleanor, as Duchess of Aquitaine and Queen of France, announced that she would accompany him. It was not unprecedented for a queen to travel, but her role would prove controversial. Chroniclers would later accuse her of vanity, of presiding over a band of ladies dressed as Amazons, of distracting knights with song and frivolity. The truth was more complex. Eleanor sought to represent her vassals and safeguard her land's military contingents. Still, the decision revealed her restlessness. The rigid court of Paris had confined her spirit. The crusade offered motion, danger, and significance. It would also set into motion the long unraveling of her marriage and her transformation from queen consort into political force. And so, as Eleanor prepared to leave France in the spring of 1147, the young queen, who had once ruled the sunlit halls of Aquitaine, found herself armored, mounted, and heading east into deserts, politics, and scandal. The heiress, who had inherited a kingdom through her father's death, was now about to discover what it meant to bear the weight of power in a world determined to misunderstand her. Was she leaving as a queen of faith, or a woman fleeing the confinement of expectation? Was the crusade a holy mission, or a restless search for freedom? You awaken again. Years later, in the cold spring of 1147, Europe hums with restless energy. Banners are being embroidered, ships repaired, and sermons preached in every cathedral. The Second Crusade is about to begin. The call to arms, issued by Pope Eugenius III, was meant to revive Christian fortunes in the Holy Land after the shocking fall of Edessa to the Turks. But beneath its holy purpose, the crusade was also a release valve for the tensions of kings, nobles, and restless knights. It was a promise of glory and a distraction from political turmoil. At the heart of this great movement rode King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, leading a vast French host across the continent. For Eleanor, it was a journey both outward and inward, a march into unknown lands and into the slow unraveling of her marriage and reputation. The departure from Vézelay. The Crusaders gathered at Vézelay, in Burgundy, in the spring of 1147, the fields surrounding the abbey filled with tents, horses, and the shimmering colour of heraldic banners. The sound of bells, trumpets, and chanting filled the air. At the centre of it all stood the royal couple Louis, dressed in plain pilgrim's garb, and Eleanor, radiant in the silks of Aquitaine, her presence commanding the admiration of the crowd. Chroniclers describe her addressing the assembled lords with confidence, urging them to take up the cross and defend the Holy Land. Some said her speech was fiery, others that it was dangerously bold for a woman. Either way, her charisma was undeniable. Knights from her duchy swore allegiance to her personally, not to the king, an early sign of the independence that would soon breed suspicion. When the ceremony ended, the great host began to move eastward, tens of thousands of soldiers, servants, and followers, stretching for miles. The journey had begun. Through the Holy Roman Empire, the Crusade's first months were a blur of fatigue and logistics. The French army followed the route through Germany, where Emperor Conrad III's troops had already set out. The roads were muddy, the weather unkind, and supplies often short. Eleanor's entourage, including her ladies, knights, and attendants from Aquitaine, became the subject of constant gossip. The chronicler Odo of Doyle, who travelled with the army, noted her Amazonian following with disdain. To him, women on crusade were an inconvenience, a distraction, and an affront to discipline. Yet, Eleanor's presence was practical, as well as symbolic. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she commanded vassals who had pledged directly to her. Her attendance ensured their loyalty. Moreover, she had learned from years of rule that distance could erode authority. To stay behind would have been to risk her duchy's allegiance. Still, the march tested even her endurance. Days were long, provisions uncertain, and relations with locals tense. German villages, unaccustomed to such massive movements of troops, closed their gates. Prices soared, tempers flared. At night, in her tent lit by oil lamps, Eleanor may have wondered what this crusade was truly accomplishing. The songs of Aquitaine, bright and lyrical, must have felt like echoes from another life, into Byzantine lands. By the time the French host reached Constantinople, the grandeur of the Byzantine Empire unfolded before them. Gold-domed churches, mosaics that glittered like jewels, and a city pulsing with trade. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos received the royal pair with great ceremony. Yet beneath the surface, distrust simmered. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were unruly barbarians. To the French, the emperor seemed deceitful and effeminate. Eleanor, however, found the city fascinating. Chroniclers later accused her of admiring Byzantine luxury too much, of being seduced by the refinement of the East. But such criticisms were less about her actions than her presence. A queen who observed and questioned was a dangerous anomaly. After a brief stay, the French moved on across Asia Minor, joining the Germans in a grueling march toward Antioch. It was there, in the parched mountains of Anatolia, that the crusade began to fall apart. The march across Anatolia. The route through Asia Minor was a nightmare of heat, dust, and ambush. The roads were narrow, the terrain mountainous. Turkish forces harried the Crusaders constantly, picking off stragglers and attacking supply lines. The army's discipline collapsed. Men deserted. Horses died. Food spoiled. Under the relentless sun, even the nobles suffered. The French army, unaccustomed to such conditions, lost thousands before reaching Italia, a coastal city where the survivors tried to regroup. Eleanor's convoy endured the same misery. Rumors spread that she insisted on her own comforts, silks, tents, wine. But the truth was simpler. As queen, she carried not luxury, but visibility. To travel without dignity would have been to invite disrespect, even rebellion. Still, the hardships exposed the growing rift between her and Louis. He sought divine meaning in every setback. She sought practical solutions. Where he prayed, she planned. Where he hesitated, she acted. It was during this weary passage that Eleanor's image began to shift from queenly companion to contentious figure. Chroniclers, mostly clerics loyal to Louis, began to frame her decisiveness as pride, the splendor of Antioch. By early 1148, the survivors reached Antioch, a brilliant and cosmopolitan city under the rule of Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's uncle. To her, Raymond represented the world. She had left behind a fellow southerner. Educated, witty, and unafraid of charm, Antioch was dazzling compared to the hardship of the march. Marble palaces, citrus gardens, and perfumed markets revived the senses of the weary crusaders. Raymond, eager to strengthen his position against the Turks, urged Louis to attack the nearby city of Aleppo, a strategic target. Eleanor agreed with him, seeing the plan as both militarily sound and politically beneficial. Louis, however, was focused on reaching Jerusalem, where he hoped to fulfill his vows. The disagreement soon became public and scandalous. Rumors spread that Eleanor was too close to her uncle. Chroniclers accused her of impropriety, even of incest, a charge almost certainly false, but deeply effective in tarnishing her reputation. Louis's clerical advisors seized upon it, framing her assertiveness as sin. The truth was simpler and more tragic. Eleanor had found in Antioch a place where she could breathe. Again, among people who spoke her language and respected her intellect. But her husband's jealousy and insecurity turned admiration into accusation, a marriage unraveling. When Louis abruptly announced his departure from Antioch, Eleanor refused to go. She declared her intention to stay with her uncle and support his campaign. It was a shocking act of defiance, one that made clear just how far apart the royal couple had drifted. Louis responded by ordering her seized and taken away by force. The Queen of France, Duchess of one of Europe's richest territories, was removed under guard from the city. Chroniclers report her weeping bitterly, though it is hard to know whether from sorrow, rage, or humiliation. From that point, their marriage was little more than formality. The long voyage to Jerusalem by sea, through storms and disease, was marked by silence between them. In Jerusalem, their reception was polite, but cold. The Crusade's goals had become confused, its leadership fractured. By the time the French forces attempted an ill-fated assault on Damascus, morale had collapsed completely. The campaign ended in failure. The Crusaders returned home in disgrace, having achieved nothing but exhaustion. The return journey. The return to Europe was slow and bitter. By the time the royal couple reached France in 1149, both had changed. Louis was still devout, but more withdrawn than ever. Eleanor, hardened by ordeal, had learned that her intelligence was both her strength and her curse. They resumed their royal duties, but the bond between them was shattered. For years afterward, they lived as husband and wife in name only. The lack of a male heir deepened their estrangement. Whispers of annulment grew louder. In public, Eleanor remained dignified, issuing charters, attending councils, and overseeing her lands. But in private, she began to plan. She understood that her future could not lie with a man who neither trusted nor understood in her. The church courts, sensitive to the politics of the age, found a convenient justification. In 1152, the marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity, that the couple were too closely related by blood. Eleanor's lands were restored to her. The Queen was once again the Duchess of Aquitaine, free in theory, but surrounded by danger. As one of Europe's richest women, unmarried and independent, she was once again the most desirable and vulnerable heiress on the continent. The road home to Aquitaine. She rode south again, through the familiar landscapes of her youth vineyards, olive groves, the warm light of Poitiers. But this time, she travelled not as a bride or queen, but as a woman newly aware of her precarious power. Bandits, mercenaries, and ambitious nobles knew that capturing Eleanor could mean controlling Aquitaine. She was ambushed at least once, but escaped. When she finally reached Poitiers, the bells of the city rang in welcome. She was 30 years old, twice a widow in all but name, mother to 2 daughters, and sovereign of her own duchy once more. But Europe was watching. Every unmarried prince saw opportunity, every king a chance to expand. Within 8 weeks of her annulment, a rider arrived from the west, Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, and heir to the English throne. He was 11 years her junior, fierce and ambitious. Their meeting would change not only her life, but the course of medieval Europe. It is the spring of 1152, and the air in Aquitaine carries the scent of renewal. The grapevines stretch in even rows along the rolling hills, their buds ready to burst. In Poitiers, Eleanor, once Queen of France, twice crowned and twice confined, now stands alone, the Duchess of a realm large enough to tempt empires. She is 30, and Europe is waiting. Her annulment from King Louis VII has left her free but dangerously exposed. To some, she is the richest widow in Christendom. To others, a prize to be seized. The roads between Poitiers and Bordeaux hum with rumour. Bands of mercenaries move in the hills, and noblemen whisper plans of abduction. Eleanor knows what she is worth, and what men might do for that worth. The young Duke, It is into this uncertain calm that Henry Plantagenet rides. He is only 19, broad-shouldered and restless, the son of Geoffrey of Anjou and Empress Matilda, the woman who had fought fiercely for her right to the English throne. Henry is ambitious beyond measure, a man who sees not just kingdoms, but patterns of power stretching across the map of Europe. Their meeting in Poitiers is not recorded in detail. Chroniclers, ever wary of strong women, offered only speculation and suspicion. But we can imagine it. Eleanor, poised and intelligent, her dark eyes appraising. Henry, energetic and untested, his words full of promise and impatience. What she likely saw in him was not youthful charm, but potential, the raw, burning drive of a man who wanted to rule. What he saw in her was equally clear: experience, land, and legitimacy. Theirs was not the naive union of young lovers, nor the cold formality of arranged marriage. It was an alliance between equals, each recognizing in the other a will strong enough to withstand the other's fire. Within weeks of their first meeting, they were married. No pomp, no approval from France, no waiting for royal consent. On the 18th of May, 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine became Eleanor, Duchess of Normandy and Countess of Anjou, wife of Henry Plantagenet, a man who would soon become King Henry II of England. A new crown. The marriage shocked Europe. Louis VII, her former husband, was furious not only for the personal slight, but because his former wife's duchy now belonged to his political rival. Through Eleanor, Henry had acquired Aquitaine, a vast territory stretching from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. In less than 2 years, Henry invaded England and claimed the throne. Eleanor, once Queen of France, was crowned Queen of England in 1154. The two together ruled a realm so large it would later be called the Angevin Empire, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and much of western France. But ruling such an empire required more than ambition. It required endurance. And endurance Eleanor had in abundance. The Queen in power. In the early years of Henry's reign, Eleanor was a formidable partner. She advised on treaties, managed her own territories, and oversaw the administration of the South. Together they produced a dynasty, 8 children in all, including Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Henry, tireless and often temperamental, rode constantly across his domains, dispensing justice and quelling revolts. Eleanor governed in his absence, especially in Poitiers and Bordeaux. She held court, resolved disputes, and issued decrees under her own seal, not as Henry's wife, but as Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right. For a time, it seemed a partnership of equals. Henry respected her judgment and intelligence. She, in turn, supported his reforms and ambitions. But as the years wore on, cracks began to show, not of love lost, but of power divided. The Court of Love. In 1168, weary of Henry's growing autocracy and the endless travel of royal life, Eleanor withdrew to Poitiers with her younger children. There, she re-established her court a haven of art, poetry, and governance. This was the era of the courts of love, semi-mythical gatherings where noble ladies debated the finer points of chivalry and romance. Whether these courts truly existed as described, or were later romantic inventions, the essence of Eleanor's influence was real. Her court became a center of Southern culture, refined, poetic, and distinctly different from the rigid legalism of the North. Troubadours flourished. Music, literature, and philosophy intertwined. Young knights and ladies learned not just warcraft, diplomacy, and wit. To her critics, it was frivolous. To those who understood power, it was subtle strategy. Eleanor was building loyalty, not through fear or arms, but through admiration and prestige. She was, once again, shaping a world in her image. The king's shadow. Meanwhile, Henry's rule grew more strained. His vast empire required constant control, his temper, constant outlet. He quarreled with nobles, with bishops, and most famously, with his once dear friend Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Eleanor's independence began to grate on him. Her duchy, her court, her son's growing loyalty to her all threatened his authority. Henry preferred obedience to partnership, and Eleanor had never been obedient. Their marriage, once a union of ambition, became a contest of will. Henry's numerous affairs, particularly with Rosamond Clifford, the so-called Fair Rosamond, deepened the divide. Chroniclers, eager for scandal, painted Eleanor as jealous and vindictive, though what truly stung her was not romance, but betrayal of power. For a woman who had endured so much, being sidelined was intolerable. The Sons' Rebellion. By 1173, the tension reached breaking point. Eleanor's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, revolted against their father, demanding real authority over their inherited lands. The rebellion stretched across France and England, drawing in foreign allies. Behind the uprising, many suspected Eleanor's influence. She denied direct involvement, but her sympathies were clear. She had raised her sons to rule, not to kneel. When the rebellion failed, Henry's vengeance was swift. Eleanor, captured while attempting to flee to Aquitaine, was arrested. For the next 16 years, the most powerful woman in Europe lived as a prisoner. Captivity. Eleanor's imprisonment was neither brutal nor comfortable. She was confined to various castles, first in England, later in Normandy under guard, with limited visitors. Occasionally, she was brought out for court ceremonies or major holidays, a reminder to all of Henry's dominance. During these years, she aged, but she did not break. Letters from chroniclers describe her as serene, watchful, and still sharp of mind. She read widely, corresponded cautiously, and waited. In the stillness of captivity, she must have reflected on her extraordinary life, from Aquitaine's sunshine to the cold stones of English castles, from 2 crowns to the silence of walls. Yet her patience would prove to be her greatest act of power, because history, as it often does, turns on the exhaustion of kings, the Lionheart's mother. In 1189, Henry II died, worn down by rebellion, war, and his own fury. His son, Richard the Lionheart, ascended the throne. One of his first acts as king was to release his mother. Eleanor, now nearly 70, rode free once more and resumed rule as if she had never left. Richard trusted her completely. As he prepared to depart on the Third Crusade, he appointed her as Regent of England. She governed in his absence, managing affairs of state, negotiating ransoms, and maintaining order. When Richard was captured on his return journey, it was Eleanor who gathered the ransom, a staggering 150,000 marks, the equivalent of years of royal revenue. She travelled across Europe, a grey-haired queen commanding respect and obedience from kings and popes alike. The woman once scorned for being too proud was now the embodiment of endurance. The last years. After Richard's death in 1199, Eleanor's youngest son, John, became king. Their relationship was strained, but she continued to serve as mediator, diplomat, and matriarch. In her 80s, she travelled across France to secure alliances for John and to manage the defence of Aquitaine against encroaching powers. Even in old age, she refused passivity. In 1202, she took refuge in the Abbey of Fontevraud, a serene monastery that had long been her family's burial place. There, surrounded by quiet stone and soft candlelight, she finally allowed herself to rest. She died in 1204, aged about 82, an extraordinary span for her era. She was buried beside Henry and Richard, between the man who had imprisoned her and the son who had freed her. Legacy. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life stretched across the 12th century. a living bridge between the age of knights and the dawn of centralized monarchy. She was queen of two kingdoms, mother to two kings, and grandmother to emperors. But her true legacy was not merely dynastic, it was cultural. Through her patronage, she helped shape the ideals of chivalry and courtly love, concepts that would define medieval Europe for centuries. Yet behind the poetry and romance lies a harsher truth: the endurance of a woman in a world that feared her intellect as much as it needed her influence. Eleanor lived not as a symbol of grace, but as an architect of power. She understood that survival required patience, that respect could be built from reputation, and that silence, sometimes, was the sharpest form of defiance. As you imagine the candles flickering at Fontevraud Abbey, their flames trembling against the carved effigies of Henry, Richard, and Eleanor, you might wonder, did she ever find peace in those final years, after so much struggle and solitude? Or did her mind, even in its quietest moments, still wander through the long corridors of her past across deserts, palaces, and battlefields, searching for a world that had never truly let her belong? You awaken in the faint chill of dawn, somewhere in northern France, perhaps around the year 1140. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. A mist hangs low over the fields, and in the distance where the horizon meets the sky, a forest of wooden scaffolds rises against the pale light. It is not a forest of trees, but of beams, pulleys, and stone. The new Cathedral of Chartres is being built. You hear the steady rhythm of hammers on limestone, the grind of ropes through wooden wheels, and the murmur of hundreds of labourers beginning another long day of toil. Men haul blocks, monks chant prayers, and somewhere in the background, women move quietly among the workers, washing linens, carrying water, cooking meals, tending to the injured, sometimes carving details no one will ever attribute to them. This is their world, one of endurance, reverence, and anonymity. For centuries, history would remember the names of kings, bishops, and master masons who built Europe's cathedrals. Yet hidden within those towering vaults are the fingerprints of women, their designs, their labours, their gifts of money and devotion, all etched into the stones that still rise toward heaven. The Cathedral Age. By the 12th century, Western Europe had begun a transformation so vast it would reshape not only the landscape, but the imagination. The age of cathedrals had dawned an era when entire cities became building sites, and faith was measured in stone. Every town wanted a cathedral taller and grander than its neighbours. To build one was to proclaim glory both divine and civic. Cathedrals were not only houses of worship, but centres of trade, learning, and politics. Yet they were also massive, fragile undertakings. The construction of a single cathedral could last a century or more, spanning generations. Whole families might be born and die beneath its scaffolds. Within this slow, communal labour, women played roles often overlooked by chroniclers, but vital to the endurance of the work: women and the workshop. To imagine the building site of a medieval cathedral is to imagine organised chaos. Stonecutters, carpenters, masons, and glaziers worked side by side, overseen by a master mason, the chief architect and engineer. His design, often drawn in chalk or scratched into tracing floors, guided the entire project. But beneath his authority was an intricate web of labour, and women were woven throughout it. Though guild rules in many towns forbade women from holding the title of master, they often worked as assistants, apprentices, and widows of craftsmen, continuing their husbands' trades. Some became expert glaziers or illuminators. Others designed embroidery and altarpieces that reflected the same geometry and symbolism as the stonework above. In cathedral towns like Chartres, Reims, and York, women ran small workshops supplying candles, vestments, or carved devotional items sold to pilgrims. Their earnings, in turn, often went back into the cathedral fund. And there were women of greater means, noble patrons and abbesses whose funding and influence shaped the very vision of these structures. Among them, one name rises like an arch above the rest. Abbess Suger of Saint-Denis, the vision of light. Though Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis is often credited as the father of Gothic architecture, his vision was not his alone. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, rebuilt in the 1142, owed much to the nuns and lay sisters who managed the abbey's lands, its fabrics, and its intricate devotional work. Records from the abbey's account books show women supervising the weaving of gold-threaded altar cloths, designing stained glass panels, and maintaining correspondence with donors. Some scholars suggest that one or more of these women may have directly influenced the aesthetic that defined Gothic style, the pursuit of lux nova, or new light. In this light-centered theology, beauty was not ornamental but spiritual. Every color, every shimmer of glass, every carved angel was meant to lead the soul upward, toward divine contemplation. Imagine one of these women, perhaps anonymous, her name lost mixing pigments for a stained glass window. Her fingers are stained with cobalt and copper. The glass glows like jewels as the sun shifts. She is crafting an image, not for fame or fortune, but for eternity. Her work will never bear her name, but it will refract sunlight for centuries, abbesses and architects. While most cathedrals were overseen by male clergy, some of the most innovative religious complexes of the Middle Ages were built under the direction of women. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the German abbess, composer, and visionary. In the mid-12th century, she supervised the construction of her abbey at Rupertsberg, an architectural and spiritual masterpiece, designed according to her own visions of divine order. Hildegard's letters reveal her deep concern for proportion, harmony, and the symbolism of sacred space. She wrote of the marriage between light and form, words that mirror the design principles of Gothic architecture itself. Or consider Abbess Herod of Landsberg, who oversaw the scriptorium of Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace. Her monumental illustrated encyclopedia, the Hortus Deliciarum, reflects not only theological insight, but an architectural sensibility, diagrams of heaven and earth drawn in precise geometry, like the blueprints of divine cathedrals. These women did not lift stones, yet they shaped the vision that guided those who did. Their abbeys and cathedrals were extensions of thought theology made visible. The builders' wives. Beyond abbesses and patrons were the quieter figures, the wives and daughters of the stonemasons. A mason's work was dangerous and demanding. Injuries were common. Death by falling stone or scaffolding collapse frequent. When a mason died, his wife often continued his trade not by carving, but by managing the contracts, apprentices, and supplies that kept a workshop running. Parish rolls from England and France record the names of dozens of such women. Agnes Masonis, Margaret Lapicida, literally, Margaret, the stonecutter. They are rarely mentioned beyond a line or two, but those few words speak volumes. In towns like Canterbury, Lincoln, and Toulouse, widows of masons completed their husbands' commissions, hiring skilled labourers to finish the work. Their names appear briefly, then vanish, but their influence endured in every completed arch. We can imagine them in the early morning, standing at the edge of the construction yard, issuing instructions while apprentices sharpened chisels and tested pulleys. They were not celebrated as architects, but they were managers, engineers, and businesswomen, roles essential to the cathedral's survival. Work, faith, and endurance. To live near a cathedral site was to live amid constant noise and dust. The clang of hammers echoed through the streets. Carts creaked under stone. Sawdust, lime, and sweat mingled in the air. For local women, this environment was not distant grandeur, but daily reality. They washed the workers' clothes, baked their bread, and patched their wounds. Many earned wages as labourers, hauling water, mixing mortar, carrying gravel. Even the smallest contribution mattered. In some towns, women donated a few coins each week to buy candles for the shrine. In others, they offered meals to traveling pilgrims who brought alms. Their labor, both physical and emotional, kept the rhythm of construction alive. The building of a cathedral was not only a feat of architecture, it was a communal act of belief. And in that community, women were its quiet heart. Anonymous artists. One of the most haunting aspects of cathedral art is its anonymity. The great rose windows, the carved capitals, the embroidered altar cloths, few bear signatures. Yet occasionally, a trace appears. In the Cathedral of Chartres, near the lower edge of a window depicting the Nativity, a faint Latin inscription reads, "Anima mea laude Dominum," my soul praises the Lord. Scholars believe it may have been added by the artist herself, a mark of devotion rather than ownership. In another cathedral, a marginal note in a 13th century, glassmaker's ledger mentions a sister of the house who paints the small faces of saints. Her name is not given, but her touch survives in the delicate curve of lips and the soft tilt of eyes in the glass above. Each brush stroke, each chisel mark, each thread of gold, the work of unseen hands. Faith in stone. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, the Gothic style reached its zenith. Cathedrals soared higher, vaults grew lighter, and windows widened to bathe interiors in colour and radiance. Chartres, Amiens, Reims, Cologne, each structure a hymn in stone, rising slowly over decades of devotion. And through all of it, the wars, the famines, the plague years that interrupted workwomen remained constant. Some prayed in the crypts, others swept the floors. Some gave coins, others gave sons. Their lives were measured not in monuments or chronicles, but in the continuity of faith. If you were to stand now in the nave of a cathedral, any of them, really, and look upward at the ribs of stone that crisscross the ceiling, you might think of those anonymous builders. But look longer and imagine the ones you cannot see, the women who prepared the lime, who washed the linen vestments, who copied the design scrolls by candlelight, who mended the robes of priests and sharpened quills for the scribes. They, too, built. The Cathedral of Chartres still stands today, its stones weathered but unbroken. When sunlight passes through its stained glass, the colours shift softly across the floor, blues and reds mingling like living breath. No one knows who ground those pigments, who cut those pieces of glass, who placed them just so. But their light endures. Centuries later, and perhaps that is its own kind of immortality, to labour in silence, and yet to leave behind something that glows forever. You can almost hear it now, the murmur of hammers, the steady rhythm of chisels against limestone, and the creak of wooden scaffolding, rising higher each year. The cathedral still grows. You have returned to the same scene, but the world around it has shifted. It is now the early 13th century, and Europe's skyline is crowded with the silhouettes of cathedrals. Chartres, Amiens, Reims, Canterbury, and Cologne, all in some phase of construction. Each town seems to live beneath its own scaffolding. The Gothic era is in full bloom. The pointed arch and ribbed vault have become symbols of both faith and ambition. Yet behind the soaring beauty lies something much more ordinary, even bureaucratic. The rise of the craft guilds, the organizations that controlled the labor, training, and standards of medieval craftsmanship. And here, again, we find women quiet but present, working within a system that both included and excluded them. The gilded world. By 1200, the guilds had become the backbone of medieval urban life. Every trade from stone cutting to glass making, from carpentry to candle making, had its own fraternity, its own patron saint, and its own strict hierarchy. A man began as an apprentice, learning his craft under a master. After years of service, he became a journeyman, traveling from town to town to perfect his skills. Only then could he hope to become a master craftsman, earning the right to open a workshop, hire apprentices, and take contracts. But what about women? Technically, guild membership was for men, but the reality, as with so many medieval institutions, was far more complicated. In the records of Paris, York, and Ghent, we find dozens of entries for femmes, maîtres, women, masters. Many were widows who inherited their husbands' workshops. Others had trained alongside them, taking on the business after his death. One such woman appears in a 1262 guild roll from Paris. Jehanne La Verrière, Joan, the glassmaker. Her name appears beside that of her late husband, Etienne, who had been a stained glass artisan, working on the Sainte-Chapelle. The Sainte-Chapelle, a royal chapel built for King Louis IX. After Etienne's death, Jehanne continued the workshop. The records note that she supplied several panels for minor Parisian churches and even trained 2 apprentices. Her signature does not appear on the glass, of course, but her presence is written into the guild books, a rare trace of acknowledgement in an age that rarely granted it. The workshop as home. In most medieval cities, the workshop and the household were one and the same. If you walked down a narrow street in Rouen or York, you'd see rows of timber-framed houses with open fronts, where artisans displayed their goods. Behind the storefront was the family's living space. Above it, the sleeping quarters. Here, wives, daughters, and servants all worked alongside the men. They mixed paints, carried tools, stoked the furnace for glassmaking, and handled the accounts. Children learned by watching. It was not unusual for a girl to grow up knowing the craft as well as her brothers, though few would be recognized for it. A guild could not easily exclude women from work that literally took place in their homes. So, quietly, the system adapted. Wives became partners in trade. The London Masons Guild, for instance, noted in a 1281 charter that the wives of masons shall have leave to continue their husband's work upon their decease, if they be found capable. That simple phrase, if they be found capable, allowed a surprising number of women to maintain workshops for years, sometimes decades. One widow, Avite Le Maison, ran her husband's shop in York for nearly 30 years, training apprentices and supplying carved ornamentation for the minster. Though her name is buried deep in tax records, her legacy remains in the carved capitals that still crown the pillars of the North Transept. A cathedral economy. To understand how women found their place in cathedral building, one must understand that cathedrals were not only spiritual projects, they were economic engines. Each cathedral drew workers, merchants, and pilgrims. Markets flourished around the construction sites. Vendors sold bread, candles, tools, and clothing to laborers. Inns filled with travelers and artisans. Money changed hands in every direction. Women thrived in this economy. They ran inns and food stalls near the sites. They sold rosaries, ribbons, and small tokens of devotion to pilgrims. Some even managed the financing of workshops, lending money to masons or glaziers in exchange for a portion of their profits. At Canterbury Cathedral, records from the early 1200s mention a certain Matilda de la Forge, who lent money to the Guild of Metalworkers for the casting of new bells. She later married a blacksmith and continued investing in his trade. At Amiens, women known as béguines, lay sisters who lived in semi-monastic communities, earned income by spinning, weaving, and producing altar cloths, much of which they sold to the cathedral chapter. The Béguines were especially influential in the Low Countries. They lived simply, devoted to charity and prayer, but independent of formal monastic vows. Their communities became centers of female labor and learning quiet revolutions in autonomy and productivity. A visitor to Ghent or Bruges in the 13th century would have found entire neighborhoods run by these women. Rows of whitewashed houses around peaceful courtyards, where the hum of spinning wheels mingled with the distant tolling of bells. Their textiles adorned the altars of Europe. Their money helped build the churches they prayed in. The art of stained glass. Among all the crafts associated with cathedrals, None captured the imagination or the light quite like stained glass. The glassmaker's art was one of color and chemistry, beauty and danger. The furnaces burned day and night. The ingredients, sand, ash, lead, copper, cobalt, were mixed in secret proportions. Too much heat, and the glass would crack. Too little, and it would dull. It was a craft of precision, and one where women, too, found a place. In smaller workshops, wives often managed the painting of faces and details. Delicate work, requiring steady hands and keen eyes. Some painted entire panels. A 13th century account from Rouen mentions Aelith, who paints the little saints, working in the studio of Master Guillaume. Though her name appears only once, her contribution is clear. She painted the miniature figures that filled the lower medallions of the great windows. In the stained glass trade, there was also secrecy. Recipes for colors and glazes were closely guarded. Families passed them down through generations. And so, many of the women who mixed these pigments became silent keepers of the craft, their knowledge preserved only in the unspoken gestures of apprenticeship. If you were to stand inside a cathedral now and gaze at the rose window, light spilling in is the result of such hidden knowledge. The combined labor of men and women whose names no one recalls, but whose work endures every dawn. Guild restrictions and the quiet resistance. By the late 13th century, the guilds began tightening their rules. As towns grew wealthier, guild membership became a form of privilege. Entry fees rose. Regulations multiplied. The once flexible boundaries that allowed women to participate began to close. In Florence, Paris, and London, women were gradually barred from full membership, allowed only to assist under their husbands' names. Some found ways around the restrictions, forming informal networks, running household-based trades, or aligning with religious communities like the Béguines. Others resisted more openly. In 1296, the records of the Tailors' Guild of Paris show a dispute involving a group of women who had begun taking commissions independently. The guild fined them for practicing the craft. Without right, they paid and continued working anyway. In cathedral towns, this quiet resistance was often tolerated. The work was too vast, the need for skilled hands too great. The church itself sometimes shielded these women, recognizing their value to the cause of devotion. And so, while official recognition diminished, the work continued invisible, but indispensable. Sacred geometry. Amid the noise and labor of the construction yard, there was also silence. The silence of thought. The great cathedrals were not built at random. Every line, every arch, every window followed a pattern rooted in sacred geometry, the belief that mathematical harmony mirrored divine perfection. Behind the drawings and measurements lay the influence of countless minds, monks, scholars, and perhaps even the wives and daughters of master masons who learned the craft by watching. Some cathedrals preserve faint traces of this intellectual labor. On the tracing floors of York Minster, Canterbury, and Reims, archaeologists have found intricate geometric designs scratched into the stone, test drawings of arches and vaults. It's impossible to know who made each line, but one can imagine a mason's wife sweeping the floor, pausing for a moment to trace the same curve, with her hand, learning by imitation, by proximity, and perhaps that is how knowledge truly passed in the Middle Ages, not through books or formal instruction, but through observation, repetition, and the quiet intimacy of shared labor. The cathedral as legacy. By the end of the 13th century, many of Europe's great cathedrals neared completion. The work that had begun with the grand vision of faith had evolved into something broader, a reflection of human endurance. For the women who had labored, invested, prayed, and painted, their reward was not recognition, but participation. They had built something that would outlive them all. And in that act, there was a kind of defiance, a statement that even Within the confines of their prescribed roles, they had shaped the world. If you were to walk through Chartres or Amiens today, you would find traces of them everywhere. In the embroidered altar cloth, in the soft faces of saints in stained glass, in the carved lilies on a column base. Each is a whisper from the past, a quiet revolution in stone and colour. But as the century closed and guilds tightened their hold, a question began to rise. Would these women's contributions survive in memory, or would they be written out of the history they helped create? Would the silent architects of faith fade forever into the background of their own cathedrals? The scaffolds are coming down. For over 2 centuries, they had clung to the walls of Europe's cathedrals, forests of wood and rope, that had grown and shifted with each generation of builders. But now, at last, the final stones are in place. The vaults are closed, the spires rise, defiant and delicate, against the grey sky. It is the 14th century. In towns like Amiens, York, and Canterbury, the work that began with faith and ambition is nearing its earthly end. The air still smells faintly of lime and smoke, but the roar of labour has quieted. The great cathedrals, centuries in the making, now stand as finished prayers in stone. And yet, in this moment of triumph, something is also fading. The women who helped raise these cathedrals, who cooked for the builders, carved small ornaments, embroidered altar cloths, managed workshops, financed construction, and mixed the very colours of the stained glass, are disappearing from the record. Their presence, once accepted out of necessity, is now being forgotten. The story of cathedral building becomes, in the chronicles, the story of men alone. The changing order. The 13th century had been an age of growth, trade expanding, towns flourishing, knowledge spreading. But as the 14th century dawned, Europe began to shudder under the weight of new hardships. The Great Famine of 1315, the 100 Years' War, and, later, the Black Death would devastate populations and economies. Cathedral work slowed or stopped entirely. Workshops closed. Guilds tightened control, reserving scarce opportunities for their male members. The church itself hardened too. The once fluid roles women had found in craft and devotion became more rigid. The Beguine communities that had flourished in the Low Countries, those peaceful enclaves of industrious, independent women, were now viewed with suspicion. By 1312, Pope Clement V issued a decree limiting their autonomy. Within decades, many Beguine houses were forced to dissolve or come under male supervision. Women's labour did not end, but it retreated into the shadows. And yet, even as the gates closed, their work continued to pulse quietly beneath the surface, as if the very stones remembered them. The unseen keepers. In the aftermath of the plague years, whole towns were half empty. Skilled labour was scarce, and rebuilding was constant. Many women found themselves widowed or orphaned, thrust into roles of responsibility. In cathedral towns, they became caretakers, cleaners, seamstresses, and choristers. The invisible machinery that kept the cathedrals alive long after the masons had gone. A widow named Margaret Atterwater, recorded in Canterbury's accounts around 1370, was paid yearly for the washing of the vestments and the tending of the lamps. She likely worked in silence, scrubbing wax and soot from fabrics embroidered by other hands long dead. Another woman, Johanna de Street Omer, is listed in the accounts of Amiens Cathedral as a garde des reliques, guardian of the relics. Her duty was to polish the silver reliquaries and ensure the sacred bones and fragments were displayed correctly during feast days. Neither role would ever make history, and yet, without them, the cathedrals would have decayed from neglect. The beauty of Gothic architecture depended not only on its creation, but on its constant maintenance, and that labour, unseen and repetitive, was overwhelmingly female. The artists behind the altar. While most craft guilds now excluded women, some artistic fields remained open, particularly illumination, textile art, and embroidery. In monasteries and urban workshops alike, women became the quiet custodians of sacred beauty. The great altar frontals, chasubles, and tapestries that adorned cathedral interiors were the result of thousands of hours of careful labor work that combined artistry, patience, and devotion. In England, the Opus Anglicanum, or English work, became world-renowned for its fine embroidery, often produced by teams of women in convents or guild workshops. These shimmering pieces of silk and gold thread depicted saints and angels so delicately stitched that they appeared to glow in the candlelight. One anonymous embroiderer, referred to only as the Nun of Shaftesbury, was praised in a 14th century letter for her skill beyond any in Christendom. Her work, like that of her sisters, would have graced the altars of cathedrals such as Salisbury and Westminster. In France, similar ateliers thrived. The names of women like Agnes la Brodeuse, Agnes the embroiderer, appear fleetingly in royal and ecclesiastical accounts. She worked in Paris around 1350, providing vestments for the royal chapel of Saint-Denis. Her artistry was sought after by bishops and abbots alike, though no signature survives. Even the stained glass, that eternal marriage of colour and light, may have continued to bear women's touch. In the Cathedral of Erfurt, records from the late 1300s mention Gertrudis Vitraria, or Gertrude the Glazier, responsible for painting the fine details of saints' faces. Her payment, a modest handful of silver coins, is all that remains of her story. Still, her glass shines. Silence in the records. By the 15th century, cathedral building had largely ended. The Gothic dream had reached its summit, and attention turned elsewhere to fortifications, palaces, and, eventually, the new ideals of the Renaissance. But as architecture evolved, the memory of those who had built the cathedrals faded. The chronicles, written mostly by men of the church, recounted the names of bishops, kings, and master masons. Suger, Villard de Honnecourt, William of Sens. The wives, daughters, and widows who had sustained their work went unmentioned. The records of women's involvement were often reduced to vague categories. The washerwomen, the widows of the masons, the women of the parish. And yet, their physical traces remained. In the carvings of capitals, one sometimes finds the faces of ordinary women, not saints or queens, but housewives and workers. They appear holding baskets of bread, carrying jugs of water, tending fires. These were not accidents of imagination, they were reflections of real life, carved by artisans who knew these figures intimately. In Chartres Cathedral, a small figure tucked into a choir screen shows a woman kneeling beside a stack of bricks, her sleeves rolled, her face calm and weary. She has no halo. She is not named, but her presence feels unmistakably human, as if the sculptor had preserved, in stone, a fleeting image of the women who kept the great work alive. Light that never dies. Cathedrals are, above all, monuments to light. When you stand beneath their vaults, what you see, the play of colour through stained glass, the glimmer of gold on stone, is not an accident of architecture. It is the result of a philosophy that saw light as divine, as the purest form of truth. And though the names of those who shaped that light are lost, their intent remains visible. Every piece of glass, every stitched hem, every carved detail speaks of devotion. For women, especially, this light held a deeper meaning. Denied the authority of the pulpit or the recognition of the guild. They expressed faith through labour, transforming service into sanctity. Each brushstroke, each needle prick, each thread of silk was a quiet form of prayer. When the sun filters through the rose windows today, it carries their work colour laid by hands that were never honoured, but that sought, in their small acts of creation, to reflect something infinite. The slow disappearance. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe began to look toward a new dawn. the Renaissance. The ideals of humanism, proportion, and individuality replaced the collective anonymity of Gothic art. And yet, in this new world of celebrated geniuses Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, Leonardo, women's creative presence shrank even further. The Renaissance demanded signatures. It valued the artist's name above the art itself. For women, who had long built beauty without recognition, this new emphasis on fame was both impossible and cruel. The cathedrals, built in communal humility, belonged to another era. And so, the women who had labored in faith slipped into the silence of history, their identities lost, even as their creations endured. Echoes in stone still. Sometimes the past whispers through the walls. In York Minster, a mason's mark, a small symbol chiseled into a stone, was discovered in a section known to have been completed under the management of a widow, Alice de Wessington, after her husband's death in 1362. The mark, a simple looping A, might have been hers, a small, private affirmation that she, too, had built. In Reims Cathedral, the archivists discovered a 14th century letter written by an unnamed nun, thanking the chapter for payment for window glass of the blue and green. The handwriting is neat, the phrasing humble. That window still shines. These are only fragments, but in them we catch glimpses of the vast, invisible network of female labour, the quiet scaffolding upon which the entire Gothic dream rested. The cathedral, as memory centuries have passed. Wars have come and gone. Fires have blackened the stones. Bombs have shattered the glass. Yet the cathedrals still stand enduring, luminous, alive. They are not just monuments to faith, but to persistence, to the countless, forgotten souls who gave their labour, their time, and sometimes their lives to something they would never see completed. The women among them, the silent architects, may not have left written names, but they left something greater, a legacy of endurance. Their cathedrals became their voice. The light that passes through those ancient windows each morning is their story retold, endlessly, without words. And when you walk through those echoing halls today, you walk not only beneath the work of kings and bishops, but beneath the unrecorded touch of women who mixed the mortar, wove the fabric, traced the lines of heaven with their uncelebrated hands. Their silence, in the end, became their monument. The royal treasury is never quiet. If you listen closely, beyond the chatter of courtiers and the clang of armour, you can hear the true heartbeat of a medieval kingdom. The soft scratch of quills on parchment, the shuffle of parchment leaves, the dull clink of coins being counted and recounted. It is a rhythm older and steadier than war, a music of numbers, seals, and ledgers of royal accountants quietly measuring the worth of a crown. And somewhere among those accountants, in the long shadow of the throne, sits a woman with ink-stained fingers. She may be a queen, or perhaps her clerk, or one of the ladies in waiting tasked with organizing the royal wardrobe. Her work is not the stuff of legend or song, yet without her hand, the kingdom would falter. This is not the history of coronations or battles. It is the history of lists of wax, honey, fabric, spices, and shoes. It is the history of how medieval monarchs budgeted their lives, and how queens, so often treated as ornaments of power, were in truth its quiet administrators. The price of majesty. To rule a medieval realm was to manage a colossal household. Every royal palace, whether Westminster, Winchester, or Windsor, was a small city, populated by hundreds of servants, guards, scribes, cooks, and artisans. Each required pay, food, and lodging. Each generated records. A medieval monarch's day might begin in splendor, but behind every robe, jewel, and feast lay the unglamorous work of accounting. The crown's exchequer, literally the chessboard, named for the checkered cloth used to count money, was the nerve centre of royal finance. There, clerks moved small counters over a grid, adding and subtracting sums as they tallied the realm's taxes, rents, and fines. For the king, these numbers meant armies, fortresses, and diplomacy. But for the queen, the ledger meant something far more intimate, the rhythm of daily life itself. Queens maintained their own household accounts, separate from the king's treasury. These documents, written on parchment rolls, sometimes dozens of feet long, recorded everything: the cost of bread, the purchase of silks, the wages of musicians, even payments to the poor. They were not glamorous, but they were meticulous. And through them, we can see perhaps for the first time the daily workings of royal life, not as ceremony, but as management. Eleanor of Provence and the price of beauty. Consider Eleanor of Provence, queen to Henry III of England in the 13th century. Her surviving wardrobe accounts, preserved in the British archives, are a study in precision. They list fabrics in Latin and Anglo-Norman, Cendulum rubrum, Samite azure, vellum album, red silk, blue satin, white velvet. Every gown, every cloak, every piece of embroidery was recorded. Who made it, how much it cost, and from which merchant it came. A typical entry might read, for 4 ells of scarlet cloth from the merchants of Lucca, for the queen's winter robe, 24 shillings. Another, for 1 ounce of gold thread for the embroidery of the sleeves, 8 pence. There is even a note of repair, for the mending of the queen's blue cloak, torn at Windsor by the wind, 2 pence, to Alice the seamstress. These are not lines of poetry, yet in them lies a kind of quiet intimacy, a glimpse of life unadorned. The queen's robe is torn by the wind. The repair is recorded, majesty, itemized. But Eleanor's accounts reveal more than fashion. They also show her as a manager, overseeing the purchase of grain, candles, spices, and alms for the poor. Her household consumed hundreds of pounds of flour a month, and barrels of wine that came all the way from Gascony. Each item had to be purchased, transported, and paid for on time. A logistical challenge that would have rivaled any modern business. Eleanor's clerks, often educated women or nuns, handled much of the daily writing. They kept careful tallies, checked invoices, and sealed rolls with wax. Theirs was invisible labour, yet indispensable to the stability of the royal court. The Queen's purse. While kings often relied on taxation or war spoils, queens drew their funds from more modest sources: jointure lands, dowries, and wardrobes. A queen's purse was both literal and symbolic. She was expected to support her own household, reward loyal servants, and contribute to charity, all within the limits of her budget. Some queens handled this with grace and caution. Others overspent disastrously. Eleanor of Provence, though intelligent and capable, was notorious for her love of luxury. Her wardrobe bills sometimes exceeded the income from her estates. She ordered tapestries from Paris, pearls from Flanders, and silk from Italy. Her love of beauty was both admired and resented. Chroniclers accused her of extravagance even as she transformed English court fashion. Still, her ledgers reveal that she balanced splendor with responsibility. For every gown of gold-threaded silk, there is a line for alms to widows or the feeding of paupers at the abbey gate. Royal piety, like royal beauty, had a cost, and she accounted for both. Matilda and the machinery of order. A century earlier, another royal woman had shown what financial mastery could mean for a crown. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, and one of England's most formidable claimants to power, ruled not through armies, but through administration. Her survival during the Civil War, known as the Anarchy, depended on her command of logistics, paying mercenaries, fortifying castles, maintaining supply routes. Though few of her account rolls survive, chronicles describe her as a woman who keeps her ledgers with the precision of a man of law. In truth, This was praise wrapped in prejudice, for the ability to record, calculate, and govern finances was viewed as inherently masculine. Yet Matilda's control of her estates and revenues sustained her followers for over a decade. Her story set a precedent for later queens. Women who understood that to control the purse was to control the realm, the clerks in the shadows. Behind every royal account book was an army of clerks, literate, disciplined, and usually invisible. Some were monks lent by monasteries, their handwriting neat and angular, their ink made from oak galls and soot. Others were lay scribes, trained in chancery schools. But among them, there were also women-educated daughters of minor nobility or widows of clerks, employed for their literacy and discretion. A record from 1287 mentions Agnes de la Chambre, a female scribe of the wardrobe, paid 3 shillings for copying and sealing documents of the Queen's business. Another, Eleanora of Bath, served as clerk to Queen Eleanor of Castile, responsible for transcribing letters and managing correspondence with merchants abroad. They worked in small, lamplit chambers, surrounded by rolls of parchment and the constant smell of wax. Their tasks were repetitive, copying lists, calculating totals, ensuring seals were unbroken. But through their hands passed the pulse of empire, the daily conversion of power into numbers. Their handwriting, steady and unadorned, was the unseen face of monarchy, the material of majesty. The account rolls are filled with items so ordinary they seem almost absurd beside the grandeur of kingship. One line notes the purchase of soap 3 bars, imported from Marseille. Another, a payment for lace for the Queen's hawk's jesses, the leather straps that tethered her hunting birds. Elsewhere, there are entries for fish sauce, cinnamon, candles, ink, and firewood. Everything had to be counted. Even the smallest extravagance, a single jeweled girdle or pair of gloves, required a written justification. The ledgers recorded when it was ordered, who delivered it, and whether it had been worn at feast or ceremony. In this way, the Queen's accounts became both diary and defence-proof that every penny had purpose. The Wardrobe Book of Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III, is a masterpiece of this genre. Compiled over decades, it details the purchase of fabrics, jewels, and gifts for foreign envoys, as well as pensions for poets and servants. There is an entry for a cup of gold sent to the lady of the emperor, and another for 20 shillings given to a poor woman at Reading who bore a child on the road. The juxtaposition is startling. Gold cups and childbirth arms, side by side, in the same hand. But that was the rhythm of royal life, wealth and charity, indulgence and duty, balanced in columns of ink, the language of order. To modern eyes, these ledgers might seem tedious, yet in their repetition lies a kind of quiet poetry, a cadence of governance. For wax and wicks, 4d. For 2, loaves for the almoner. 1 penny. For a new robe for the lady's greyhound, 6d. For the mending of a clasp, a halfpenny. Each line is a heartbeat of the medieval state, steady, methodical, unyielding. Through such records, we see queens not as distant figures, but as household managers, balancing faith, family, and finance. Their ledgers tell us when they travelled, whom they rewarded, what they ate, what they feared to overspend. In them, majesty becomes human, ink and authority. In the medieval world, writing was power. A spoken command might fade, but a written order endured. A seal on parchment was a declaration of authority, as binding as a sword's edge. By maintaining their own account books, queens claimed a small but real measure of sovereignty. They tracked income from estates, approved expenditures, and occasionally used their financial independence to influence politics. When Queen Philippa funded the Order of the Garter alongside her husband, she paid for the initial robes herself, a quiet gesture that ensured her inclusion in a circle otherwise reserved for men. Eleanor of Castile, too, used her revenues to purchase lands independently, expanding her holdings until she became one of the wealthiest landowners in England. Her careful accounting made her both admired and feared. In their ledgers, these women carved out a space for authority, one not granted by war or decree, but earned through competence. A quiet power. Numbers, after all, are a form of control. While kings ruled by spectacle, queens ruled by calculation, by the invisible work of keeping the machine of monarchy moving. Every payment authorized, every tally balanced, was a decision. Behind each, a hand and a mind. And though their names rarely appear beside those of their husbands in the chronicles, the truth remains. A kingdom without a ledger is a kingdom without order. The quill stills, the ink dries. A clerk rolls up the parchment, ties it with silk, and presses a wax seal upon it, the faint impression of a crown. The numbers will rest until morning, when the counting begins anew. And you might wonder, in a world of battles and banners, why did so much depend on the quiet diligence of women with ledgers? When a medieval queen balanced her ledgers, she was not merely tracking coins, she was exercising one of the few forms of power left to her. Royal women in the Middle Ages could not command armies without their husbands' approval, nor issue decrees on their own authority. Yet in the quiet management of their estates and household accounts, they discovered a narrow but potent form of independence. Every expenditure carried a message. Every payment told a story. In the kingdom's official narrative, the king ruled by divine right. But beneath that surface, queens moved coins, and through coins, moved people. The power of the purse money was the most persuasive language of the medieval court. Loyalty could be bought, favors earned, silences secured. For kings, money was a tool of expansion. For queens, it was a means of influence. Each queen's wardrobe, the name for her financial department, operated almost like a miniature government. There were clerks, receivers, messengers, and treasurers, each recording, transporting, and securing funds. But the most important element of this machinery was discretion. A queen could use her wardrobe to do what the king's exchequer could not: act privately. Her expenses were her own, and while she was expected to maintain decorum, she could redirect money toward allies, religious houses, or causes she favored, without public scrutiny. This secrecy gave rise to a quiet diplomacy, a shadow economy of royal influence, Eleanor of Castile and the lands that bound a kingdom. Few queens mastered this better than Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I. To the casual observer, Eleanor appeared every inch the model queen, devoted, pious, and loyal. Yet beneath the surface, she was also one of the most formidable property managers in medieval England. Her household accounts record the steady accumulation of manors, estates, and rents, acquired through both inheritance and purchase. Some chroniclers accused her of avarice, others simply noted her efficiency. By the 1292, her estate rivaled that of many great earls. Eleanor's financial acumen was no idle pursuit. It was strategy. Each estate she acquired strengthened the royal family's grip over the realm's nobility. When she purchased lands from indebted lords, she often secured not only territory, but political loyalty, subtly binding local power to the crown. Her accounts show a queen engaged not in indulgence, but in governance. She bought wool from her own estates, reinvested profits in property, and oversaw repairs of barns, mills, and granges. Her clerks reported to her regularly, often in person, and she demanded detailed written statements. To some, she was feared